We're going to kick off our shuffle series here this morning. But before I do, on the way in this morning, my son in the back seat of the car was singing Scooby-Doo. You know that Scooby-Dooby-Doo. And so we're talking, and then I hear this in the back of my seat. And so then I flip on my iPhone and I look up the song, and while I'm driving, which is a no-no. And so I find it and I play it. So then we start jamming out to the song in the car, Scooby-Dooby-Doo, and I look back in the mirror, and no kidding, I see him, and he's like this. Boom, boom. I'm like, that's my 4-year-old jamming out, Scooby-Dooby-Doo, rock, we're like hardcore here this morning. So that was our trip in this morning. As we start this series, Shuffle. Shuffle, obviously, is a mode. It is a way of, it's on iPods, MP3 players, CD players. It's a mode or a button you can hit that just mixes up all the songs, right? So that if you're used to all the songs in the same order, you know exactly what's happening. You hit the mode button, it just shuffles them all up. So that's what we're doing. Over the next 3 weeks, we're going to be talking about 3 different parables of Jesus. So today, as we begin, what is a parable? A parable is basically, it's a story that illustrates a point, right? A parable is meant to highlight a specific spiritual principle. And I think the word there is specific. It's important for us not to look to too many details within the parable, right? So we're going to be talking about a parable found in the Gospel of Luke today called the rich man and Lazarus. There's more than 40 parables of Jesus that we know of found in the Gospels, and they're all found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptics. There's no parables found in the Gospel of John. Today's parable, the rich man and Lazarus, was found only in Luke. And that's helpful because here in a little bit we're going to explore what the whole book of Luke is about, and hopefully that will help us interpret the rich man and Lazarus. So today we're going to read through the parable. It's not super long, and that's okay. We're going to explore what the parable meant in context of that book and that chapter, and then what it can mean for us today. So let's go ahead. I want to invite you to read along with me the first part, and I'm going to offer commentary here and there. So this parable is found in Luke chapter 16. It starts in verse 19, and it says, "There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who longed to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table, and even the dogs would come and lick his sores." So before we move on, let's move back to that slide. By the way, sumptuously, my whole point, if I could say that word and get it right today, that was like a win for me. Because during that sermon, I kept saying scrumptiously or different words. I'm like, oh my, sumptuously. So here we have a contrast of a very, very wealthy man and a very, very poor man. Purple was a rare dye in that time. It was a very expensive, or maybe the most expensive form of clothing. Obviously, it said he feasted sumptuously every day. This man not only had everything he wanted, really we get a picture of everything he needed. In essence, this was like a picture of the Scottsdale life. Not to pick on anybody here, but when people think of the highlight Scottsdale life, this guy would be driving the Maserati, wearing the nice clothes, going out to eat at 5-star restaurants, going golfing every other day, and escaping this heat all summer long somewhere else, right? So this guy had not only everything he needed, he had everything he wanted, right? And contrasting that with somebody who had really nothing he wanted and very little that he actually needed. So let's continue on to verse 22. And it says, "The poor man died and was carried away by the angels to be with Abraham." I want us to pause right there before we read on. There is Jewish folklore that's written and it's talked about how angels would carry away the righteous to places of rest. So when people heard this in the first century, they would have known, even though we're not given any information about Lazarus, that Lazarus was a righteous man. This would have been common for them to understand. So let's move on. Then it says, "The rich man also died and was buried. In Hades, where he was being tormented, he looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. He called out, 'Father Abraham, have mercy on me and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in agony in these flames.' But Abraham said, Child, remember that during your lifetime you received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner evil things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. Besides all this, between you and us is a great chasm that has been fixed, so that those who might want to pass from here to you cannot do so, and no one can cross from there to here. And the rich man said, Then, Father, I beg you to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, that he may warn them, so that they will not also come to this place of torment. And Abraham replied, They have Moses and the prophets. They should listen to them. And the rich man said, No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent. And Abraham replies, If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone rises from the dead. There's so much information here we could talk about. But let me just say, many people interpret this and 1 or 2 other passages in Scripture as very detailed descriptions of the afterlife, which my perspective, my opinion is that is not only wrong, but often leads us and distracts us from what the key issue here is. So actually, when many people think of hell, it conjures up images. This is one of those passages, but there's very few. And those images that many people think of when they think of hell actually stem more from medieval art and literature, such as Dante's Inferno, than it actually does from the Bible itself, right? And in light of that, there's a scholar named N.T. Wright, one of pretty much the preeminent New Testament scholars. In one of his books, Surprised by Hope, he writes the following. He says, It is therefore only by extension and with difficulty that we can extrapolate from the many gospel sayings that articulate this urgent, immediate warning to the deeper question of a warning about what may happen after death itself. The 2 parables that appear to address this question directly are, we should remember, parables. They're not actual descriptions of the afterlife, and they use stock imagery from ancient Judaism, such as Abraham's bosom, which some interpret as heaven. It can be interpreted differently as well. Not to teach about what happens after death, but to take, and then he says, to take the scene of Abraham, the rich man, and Lazarus literally is about as sensible as trying to find the name of the prodigal son. Jesus simply didn't say very much about the future life. He was, after all, primarily concerned to announce God's kingdom coming to earth as it is in heaven. In essence, N.T. Wright is saying it's ridiculous that we look at all of these descriptions about the afterlife, right, when it was meant to point us to something different. Has anybody ever seen Princess Bride, right? So, awesome, Omar, thanks. There's this character in the very beginning, and he uses this word over and over and over again. He uses the word inconceivable, all right? Is it bringing up, you guys remember that? Okay. So there's that scene then where the protagonist is climbing up this cliff using a rope, and then the 3 bad guys, two of them actually, cut the rope. So the rope falls, he jumps on the cliff. And he's using that word over and over, inconceivable. So the other guy gets there, and they cut the rope, and they're like, is he still there? And they're like, yeah, he grabbed onto the cliff. And the guy, of course, says, inconceivable. So he's using this word in so many different contexts. And I love one of the characters turns to him, and he says, you keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means, right? It's one of the best. So window into my brain here, which is scary, I know. But when people start to talk about hell as like eternal fiery torment and different things, like I keep thinking like that actual picture in my mind of Princess Bride, like you keep saying this word hell, like you think it knows, I don't think it means what you think it means, right? So moving on from there, if it's not about hell, if it's not about that, then what of course is it about? Different ways of interpreting it. I'm going to offer one here today that I think is important and practical for each and every one of us. There's 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They each have different focuses on the life and teachings of Jesus. They each were written by different people to a different audience, all right? Because of that, they have different focuses on what they're trying to accomplish. Luke's Gospel is primarily focused on the poor, the outcast, and the oppressed. And we'll go through and read a few highlights of that. And he often, in Luke's gospel, contrasts the poor with the rich. and almost brings this warning to the rich. So Luke 6, verses 20 and 26, I'll read this, and you'll see the contrast here. The first few verses are talking about the poor, and they say, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh." And then it contrasts that with the rich. "But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you will be hungry. Woe to you who are laughing now, for you will mourn and weep." In what is called sort of Jesus' inaugural sermon, when he first starts his public ministry, he gets up in the synagogue and he reads from a scroll of Isaiah, and he reads the following found in Luke 4, which is up on the slide. "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." We see here the poor, the captive, the blind, the oppressed. This is a common theme in the book of Luke. And another verse found in Luke 7:22, after Jesus was baptized by John, John's faith after he's put in prison begins to waver in who Jesus is. So we read that Jesus sends John's disciples back, and he says, "Go tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive the sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the poor have good news brought to them." Some scholars suggest that in Luke's gospel, salvation means liberation. That Luke is specifically geared towards and focused on the poor, and that God brings liberation or freedom for those who are poor, oppressed, the outcast are welcomed in. In essence, God's heart is for those that don't have a voice, those that don't and cannot speak for themselves. And with it, it brings this sort of critique to the rich, in essence saying, if you and your heart isn't geared towards that and you are not speaking on behalf of the poor, be very, very careful. It's a warning. It's like a sharp critique. And a message like this, it's easy sometimes to say being rich is evil or having wealth is evil, and I don't think that's the case. But I do think in the Gospel of Luke and in this parable specifically, there's a sharp warning and critique, because with riches and wealth bring a lot of responsibility. So let's look at, there's a lot of information. We're going through some information. Everybody still with me here this morning? Okay. Luke 16, the entire chapter, can be divided into two parables. There's one about a dishonest manager, and there's one about the rich man and Lazarus. They both start exactly the same. There was a rich man who. Obviously, it's all about wealth and riches. There's a certain focus here. In between these, actually, the first parable ends with the following verse that's very, very well known to most of us. Luke 16:13, and you can read it on the slide. It says, no slave can serve two masters. For a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. Again, it's contrasting this wealth. Where's God at? What side is God at? Is God's heart geared towards and open to the poor and the oppressed? And then between the parables, Jesus says a few things, and we're given some commentary. And I think this is helpful and important because it points out and highlights not only who was listening, but maybe specifically who exactly this parable might have been geared towards, or why Jesus spoke this. So let's read together Luke 16, verses 14 and 15, and it says this. The Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all this, and they ridiculed him. So Jesus said to them, "You are those who justify yourselves in the sight of others, but God knows your heart. For what is prized by human beings is an abomination in the sight of God." So we know that the Pharisees were listening in. We know, according to Luke, he's specifically pointing out that these Pharisees should be the religious leaders, and yet they were lovers of money, lovers of power, thirsty for that. In essence, the critique is you're pursuing this and neglecting what really matters to God. It's a critique. It's a harsh critique. The parable, I believe, is primarily about power and privilege. So we're going to talk a little bit about power and privilege. And the question I want us to ask ourselves and to wrestle with is, do you see yourself as the rich man, or do you see yourself as Lazarus? And because this is like a challenging sort of message, I'll use myself as an example here. A few years ago, my wife and I, we quit our jobs, we went back to school, we rearranged our life, we sold one of our vehicles. No one financially helped us through or paid for our school, so we struggled a lot. And that kind of continues on to today. We have one car, we live in a fairly small place, we don't have a lot of excess, and so it's hard for me to see myself as privileged most of the time. And what I honestly do is I honestly struggle because I compare myself to those who have more. It doesn't even have to be a ton of money, just somebody who has a house and 2 cars. I'm like, oh, that sounds so nice. They have more. And what that does then is, hey, I don't have very much. I'm not very privileged. Look at them. They have more. That's what privilege is. But then it neglects the 99.9% of the people that have far less than me, right? So you see how this works. In fact, one of the reasons why we here at One Church try to create places where we can serve, like Feed My Starving Children and Chandler Christian Community Center, is because it exposes us to the people that have less. And at the same time, then we begin to realize that we have privilege. And I don't think privilege is bad or evil in itself. But most of the time, we often don't realize it. And I often don't realize it. So this last week, we had 20 people from One Church who went and served at Feed My Starving Children, which we do the second Wednesday of every month. When we go there, we served and we helped with a group of other people. We helped provide 77 meals for 77 kids to feed them for an entire year. They have it down. Like when you get there, they go through everything and then they crank up the music and you just boom, boom, scoop it, and then you seal the bag and you push it off and there's like a whole system. I mean, they got it down, right? But by me going there, I realize 6,200 kids die every day of starvation. I see stories of kids who are struggling and starving, and then it exposes the privilege that I have. Like, I don't struggle with hunger, right? I don't struggle with that. I'm sorry, I'm kind of tearing up a little bit. I'll try not to get too emotional with you guys. But it exposes the fact that I have privilege, right? By being there, by engaging and seeing people who have more need. Webster's dictionary defines privilege as a right or benefit that is given to some people and not to others. It also says it's the advantage that wealthy and powerful people have over other people in a society. So truthfully, I think I go about most of my life not realizing, very oblivious to the power of the privilege that I have. And much of my life, I've been completely oblivious. And I remember one of the first times where this became more clear to me. It was early in seminary, and I was exploring a certain denomination and what it took to become ordained in that denomination. So they went through all the hoops you have to jump through, all the training you need, all the psych evals, everything. And finally, the lady said, she's like, well, I want to be honest with you to let you know that most of our churches are getting older. Most of them are declining. And there's no guarantee that you're going to have a church. So you're going to go through all of this seminary training, money, and investment. And by the way, there's no guarantee, right? So she just was being real and honest with me. But then she said, but if you are a young white male, then you probably have a very good chance. And that stood out to me because, not because she was being prejudiced, but just the fact that the population, most pastors in America are white males, right? And so that became real for me and exposed, because I am a white male, there's an extra privilege most of the time that I'm oblivious to. Now, of course, you could say, well, then you shouldn't be a pastor, right? Well, then get rid of your privilege and don't do that, which I don't think is a good reaction. Get rid of your wealth. Don't be wealthy. Don't be rich, whatever. Just chuck it out. Anti-wealth, anti-privilege. Man, if you're a white male, oh my goodness, right? Or if you have privilege, well, then you must be evil somehow. And I don't think that's helpful at all. I think the question rather is, how do we choose to use that privilege? Are we aware of it? And how do we choose to use it? Nearly half the world's population live off of $2.50 or less a day. 805 million people don't have enough food. 750 million people don't have clean access to water. 25% of the world do not have access to electricity. And 80% of the people live off of $10 or less a day. So if you and I, if we live off of more than $10 a day, we're in the top 20%. And if you have a college education, you're in the top 6.7%, right? And here's something I find extremely convicting, I guess you could say. We're going to talk about wealth equality here in a couple weeks, but the top 1% of the world owns roughly 50% of the wealth. Massive inequality, massive injustice. And then here is the kicker, the stinger. You're in the top 1% if you make roughly $32,400 or more. That number might be a couple years old, so maybe it's a little higher, but you're in the top 1%. So it's easy for me to say, I don't have privilege, I'm struggling, whatever, and then I realize, look at the rest of the world, and then look at me, and realizing, wow, I'm in the top few percent of the entire world, that there is privilege that I do have. I'm going to read a quote from a book called Love Wins. By the way, if you struggle with this idea of a loving God and hell and how this can all work, Rob Bell's book, Love Wins, is one of the best books I've read. It's a simple read. He's just being honest and struggling with questions. So that would be a great resource for you. It's really impacted my life, and I know others of you in this place as well. But here's what he says. He says, the story about the rich man and Lazarus was an incredibly sharp warning for Jesus' audience, particularly the religious leaders, who Luke tells us were listening, to rethink how they viewed the world, because there would be serious consequences for ignoring the Lazaruses outside their gates. To reject the Lazaruses was to reject God. Of course, then the question that I wrestle with is, am I ignoring the Lazaruses outside of my gate, right? And on that note, what might be some practical ways, some practical steps? How do I not ignore the Lazaruses at my gate, those that don't have the privilege that I do and that I experience? So here's two very simple, very practical steps that we can each take as ways to step out and engage people and engage the Lazaruses around us. First, can I volunteer and help serve 4 to 6 hours a month? And second, can I give a percentage of my income to something, to someone, to a cause? First, is your time. Do you have time? Is there a time in the month that you can give on a regular basis? We try to create that, but maybe those times don't work for you here. Maybe there's part of your work or part of your family where you can get together and take time and commit 4 to 6 hours one afternoon and say, we're going to go, we're going to serve. And again, I think part of that does is it exposes us, oh, look at my privilege, right? Because it's too easy to get insulated. We live around people that have the same or slightly similar socioeconomic status as us. And that's just how the world is. Nothing wrong about that. Your neighbors have similar houses to you. And so going out and serving a people, a group, a cause will expose the fact that not everybody lives like I do, right? And the second thing, what percentage of my income can I give? I have a lot of wealth. I have more than I think I do when I look at the rest of the world. So my wife and I, we give here to One Church because we believe in One Church. We don't talk about money a lot here because probably the stain in many of our minds from the televangelists that get on TV and ask for millions of dollars. But the very fact is that One Church wouldn't exist if people didn't give. So we wouldn't have a Sunday morning gathering. We wouldn't have a place for the kids. We wouldn't be able to reach out to our community. We wouldn't be able to do those things. So if One Church is a place that you feel drawn to, that you attend on a regular basis, I want to invite you to possibly think, can I give a percentage to One Church? And maybe there's another organization, another way that you can give as well. But what I have found, my wife and I were trained in a tradition where it taught that if you don't give 10% to the church, then you were disobeying God. and that you were cursed because of that. And so I don't believe that is the heart of God. I don't believe that's the scriptural basis for that. But I do believe that as we are generous, we open ourselves up. That when we are greedy, what happens is we become narrower and narrower and narrower. And then we focus on riches or wealth, or we focus on ourselves. And then we begin to ignore the needs of others around us. So part of this is just ways that we can open ourselves up to expose the privilege that we have. And also, whatever helps others will benefit us. So today, as a way of transition, I have a slide up here. It's a slide of a young woman who's a part of One Church. This is Mercedes holding a little baby here. Some of you don't know Mercedes. Mercedes left a few months ago. She traveled across the world to Cambodia. So she left her privilege to go serve those who do not have any privilege. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to attempt to interview her, even though she's not here. So I wrote to her some questions, and she wrote some back to me. And I think you'll appreciate one of the things I love most about Mercedes is her heart, and that she never comes across as judgmental or condemning. And often in talks like this, or when people speak about power and privilege, you can get that feeling. And I hope that you don't walk away with that feeling. And her heart, I think, will shine through. So there's 6 questions I asked, and I'm just going to read to you what she responded. The first one I asked is, first of all, she said hi to everyone here. So if you know Mercedes, I want to invite you, Facebook message her, email her, encourage her, let her know that we're here. She says she keeps up with the podcast, and she's very thankful for a place like One Church. And so I asked her, what have you been doing, and how have you adjusted? And she said, I've adjusted well, better than expected. My team has welcomed me with open arms and helped me with the transition. Here, I have been doing been teaching multiple English classes, help with sewing project, focus on empowering women to learn a trade, and also co-leading a short-term mission trip that included people from all around the world. In addition to these things, I work on a rotation of tasks with the help of the staff here. Some of the things we do regularly are house visits for new Christians, delousing children, so literally picking off the lice of the kids there, and having a house church of sorts, and best of all, teaching and playing with the kids. Then I said, what's been the hardest thing for you since moving to Cambodia? And she said, the hardest part for me has honestly been feeling of inadequacy and feeling small. Because I don't speak the language yet, I need to rely on others for everything, whether it be teaching a lesson, providing encouragement, or even playing a game. Someone else has to translate for me. It is difficult because I want to be able to do it all. I want to get my friends out of the red light district. I want families to allow their children to go to school instead of working. I want people to believe that women and children are valuable, but I can't do any of it on my own, and it's truly overwhelming at times. So here's a person just being real, like, I want to do more, but I'm limited right now. And then I said, I asked, how have you seen God at work in your life, in your area? And she said, cheesy as it sounds, it is this time I think I've seen God most at work in myself. The people here are new to Christ's teachings, but they live them so well. They love and give without restraint. If all they have is one meal, then they will invite you to join, even if they cannot afford their next meal. I'm going to try not to be emotional. I'm doing my best here. They have faith beyond understanding. They believe that God loves them regardless of their circumstances. It is so authentic and beautiful and calls me to want to live with more love and gratitude myself. It's a beautiful heart. And then I asked, since we're talking about privilege, she knew what we're going to be sharing a little bit. In your experience, how has privilege shaped or changed in your view? And so she said, when I lived in the States, I felt so much guilt for living a life of privilege. I assumed if I didn't pack up and move to a third world country, then I couldn't do any good. I want to encourage you guys, that's all of you guys here, in saying that is not at all true. If you have the luxury of living in the Western world, there is something you can do. Do you have enough money to go to a coffee shop at least once per month? Then you have enough money to give to a worthy cause. Do you have enough time to binge on Netflix? Then you have enough time to volunteer at an organization in your area. All around you, there are organizations and people doing amazing things for the world. They need others who are willing to pitch in with their time and funds. And then she said this, and I was like, man, this is awesome. Good stuff in a sermon. She said, don't feel guilty about how much you have received. Feel honored about how much you can give. Gosh, I'm losing it. I try not to. And then the last question I asked her, she said, I asked, has it been satisfying helping others with less privilege, and how so? And she says, there's nothing more fulfilling than loving and helping the needy. I think there is a paradox in that the more we give, the less we want. When you hold a child who has been trafficked and abused in your arms, suddenly, what kind of car you drive doesn't matter anymore. Caring for the oppressed doesn't only free them, but it also frees us. If the rich man would have given up some of his possessions to help Lazarus, then yes, Lazarus would have felt better in that moment. But more than that, the rich man would have been freed of the hold of wealth that wealth had in his own life. And she says, I don't believe in a literal hell that is a place of eternal torment. I think the exaggeration in this parable highlights the suffering caused by our own selfishness. Isn't that a cool perspective? I'm like, man, that's awesome. It's less about the rich man, or how the rich man could have alleviated Lazarus' suffering, and more about how Lazarus could have freed the rich man by giving him the opportunity to love his fellow man. And I just love, don't feel guilty about how much you have received, but feel honored about how much that you can give. See, often I think there comes sometimes this guilt or shame or condemnation. You privileged, you wealthy, you're just evil. You're a part of the whole system. You're making it worse, right? And then it's easy to be anti-privilege. Instead, I hope that it comes across three things. First, we realize whatever privilege that we have as much as we possibly can. And then two, the question then is, what will we do with that privilege? And realizing that there's people around us that have less, that are less privileged. And hopefully in very practical steps, is there ways we can give time? Is there ways we can give money to people and things and organizations around us? And as we do, it frees us of that bond, of that restraint, of that power that wealth can sometimes have on us. So the question, of course, is will I ignore the Lazaruses around me? Or will I use whatever wealth, whatever privilege, time, money I have to help others? And the great thing is, I think we're doing that here at One Church. I think we can be doing it more always. Probably in my life and yours, we can all be doing a little bit more. Again, it's not something to feel guilty about, but it's something to hopefully be encouraged by, experience, and see the privilege we have, and know that the heart of God is upon those that have less privilege than us.